This is very important because the country is at a leading and pivotal point across the global agenda. President Cyril Ramaphosa has opened the first G20 meeting of foreign ministers in Nasrec, Johannesburg. Dr. Oscar van Heerden is a senior research fellow in African diplomacy at the University of Johannesburg and joins us now. Dr. van Heerden, thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it. No United States ultimately, and I mean, not that the lower delegations aren't there, but when you don't have the trade minister in Marco Rubio, you don't ultimately have the finance minister as well, Scott Besant, then does this lose significance, or can we continue the global agenda without them?
Well, you know, Arabile, the fact of the matter is this is the G20. It's the 20 largest economies in the world.
Yeah.
Of course, South Africa is also there as being the largest economy on the African continent. And the African Union is there together with the European Union. So all the major players, all the major economies are in the room. One would have wanted the largest economy of the world to be in the room, but clearly they opt not to be there. But I do think the G20 is going to continue. It's going to be fruitful. And the junior staff that the United States is sending from the embassy here in South Africa would have to relay those decisions and those policy choices that will come out of the G20.
So how exactly do we set the agenda at a meeting like this then, when you're probably not fearful, but are trying to be measured about the kind of communication you send out globally, the kind of structures you want to put in place, and how exactly you want everybody to come together in order to fight one similar goal? How exactly do we set the agenda?
Well, you set the agenda exactly as President Ramaphosa has done earlier today at the ministers' meeting by indicating, he started with giving a geopolitical sketch about where we are as the world, a very bleak picture in terms of the conflicts that's taking place, in terms of all indicators with regards to poverty, with regards to inequality and sustainability, lagging behind. And in as much as the president is saying this G20 is placing Africa front and center of the agenda, we should take note of the global south and, of course, the developmental requirements for the global south in the areas of post-disaster management, debt reduction, just energy transition, and, of course, inclusive growth.
Dr. van Heerden, allow me to take a step back, if you will. Why does the G20 matter, especially to South Africa? Because while we may be one of the larger economies in Africa, we have so many of our own pertinent issues that perhaps we should also be focusing on. And for us to continue to put on the charm offensive when, for example, we couldn't even put our own budget to Parliament yesterday, one wonders whether we have too many competing priorities, ultimately meaning we don't get to focus on the things that matter, our own people. What do you think?
You know, Arabile, I understand the point you're making. However, I think it's important for the viewers to also know that what happens global affects local, and what happens locally affects global. A simple thing like a conflict, for example, between Russia and Ukraine has profound implications on the price of oil, the price of gas, as well as fertilizer, which is required within the farming and agriculture sector. Everyone gets affected negatively because there's that conflict. So I think the truth of the matter is that in as much as these challenges and problems might seem far afield, it actually impacts on South Africa and South Africans in the developing world. So I do think that the G20 matters. These larger economies, it's our trading partners. It's about, for example, issues of AGOA. It's about issues of the bilateral TDCA agreement with the European Union. These forums, in as much as it discusses the global issues, it's also an opportunity for our various ministers to meet their counterparts and fine-tune some of the trade agreements that ultimately benefits locals and the South Africans.
Is this also an opportunity for South Africa to garner different contracts that we may lose from the United States, including things like US aid and, of course, the at-risk AGOA?
Absolutely. It would be short-sighted on the part of our Minister of DTIC, of our finance, and many others, agriculture and so forth, not to see this as an opportunity to begin to put in place alternative markets. Of course, we are always looking for markets to grow the economy, but particularly now when we are faced with an obstinate ally in the form of the United States of America, we have to begin to look at alternatives, because I think on the current trajectory, we are going to lose the AGOA agreement, and there are going to be certain sanctions meted out against South Africa, unfortunately.
From your analysis, I mean, which countries kind of offer the best venue, the best place for South Africa to be looking at? We've gone Europe. That's always been the case. Do we just strengthen and broaden our ties there when one considers that Europe itself is going through its own monumental issues? If you go to the Far East, of course, China in itself is struggling to get that 5% growth target. And yes, they're looking to the rest of the world, but still so much at play. Who becomes the right partner for South Africa?
You know, South Africa has always straddled this trade issue very conscientiously, very maturely. It's not about either or. Thus far, in the last 30 years of our democracy, the South African government has managed to have good trade agreements with North America, with the EU, with countries of the South, of the East, China, as well as countries in Africa. I think that agenda must be continued. I think where there is possibilities of expanding markets, particularly on the African continent, that opportunities must be seized. And of course, you know, it's not about an antagonistic relationship with the United States of America. I think at the moment, there are some difficulties in the diplomatic arena. It's not insurmountable. It can still be dealt with. You know, President Trump is going through a particular period now where he is anti the South African government, but that might very well change as we go forward in the course of the year. Don't be surprised if Donald Trump actually comes to the Heads of State Summit in November.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. And of course, they do take over the presidency as well, ironically, after South Africa as well. So does that mean that the message that is sent out from the G20 presidency this year could actually be made null and void if Donald Trump just comes in next year and ultimately looks and seeks for a new agenda entirely? How much risk of that is there?
There's always that risk, but I think if you look at the past few G20s, there has been a continuation of the developmental agenda from India to Brazil to South Africa. Of course, the next presidency, which is the United States of America, can decide to go in an opposite direction. It's not, I won't put it past President Trump to do that, but I think it would reflect quite badly on the United States if indeed they are anti every developmental goal that was placed there, not only in the G20, but also in terms of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and other fora. I think that the Trump administration and the Secretary of State, in particular, the State Department, will have to think very carefully as to whether they want to take such a course of action.
All right. Just as a final thought, Dr. van Heerden, what else can we attain out of the G20 presidency this year for South Africa?
I think that the 4 priority areas that the president has outlined is good priority areas. I think that it requires a lot of work. The just energy transition, just by way of example, is a difficult one. We saw that the COP conference, there was a cop-out on the part of the Global North. They are not coming to the party in terms of the commitments that they've made and the money that they said they would be making available to the Global South to actually have that journey that the president is talking about. So these are going to be tough negotiations. It's going to be tough talks. But I do think it's a good thing that the president has placed it firmly on the agenda, and Africa and South Africa can only benefit if we succeed.
If we succeed, we can only benefit from something like this. Thank you so much for the time. Dr. Oscar van Heerden, Senior Research Fellow for African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg.